You don't belong in first class. Get out before I remove you myself!
The gate fell silent the moment the captain pointed his finger inches from her face. You don't belong in first class. Get out before I remove you myself. No one defended the elegant woman standing there. Flight attendants looked away, suddenly very interested in their clipboards. Passengers quietly raised their phones, convinced they were filming nothing more than another traveler trying to sneak into an expensive seat. She lowered her eyes for a moment, not from shame, but from something closer to disappointment, the kind that comes from watching a familiar story repeat itself in a brand new room. She quietly picked up her leather briefcase, the one with her initials pressed into the corner, and answered with 2 words that carried no anger at all. I understand. 28 minutes later, the aircraft doors reopened. Every engine shut down, one by one, the low hum of the cabin fading into something heavier than silence. Airport police walked up the aisle first, followed by federal investigators in plain gray suits, and then, trailing behind them, 3 members of the airline's own board of directors. Nobody on that plane understood yet what was happening, only that something had shifted, something irreversible, something that no apology would be able to undo. This time, when the cabin door opened and the woman who had been thrown off the flight walked back through it, every single passenger rose to their feet. Not for the captain standing frozen near the cockpit. For her. Her name was Diane Coleman, and at 42 years old, she had built a reputation that very few people in the corporate world ever managed to earn twice. She ran a billion-dollar consulting firm that specialized in restructuring failing companies, the kind of work that required equal parts brutal honesty and quiet patience, the kind that turned around organizations everyone else had already given up on saving. Boards in 3 different industries had hired her firm specifically because of her reputation for finding the rot hiding underneath polished quarterly reports, the small cultural failures that eventually became enormous financial ones. She had done it without ever needing to announce who she was the moment she walked into a room, and colleagues who had worked with her for years still occasionally forgot, for a moment, just how much power sat quietly behind her calm demeanor. Diane disliked the performance of status, the watches, the entourages, the constant reminders other executives seemed to need in order to feel important in front of strangers. She traveled alone, checked her own bags, carried her own coffee through crowded terminals, and answered her own phone, like anyone else trying to get somewhere on time, without making a scene of it. That morning, the international airport was packed wall to wall, with business travelers rushing between gates, the kind of crowd that made everyone a little shorter on patience, and a little quicker to judge the person standing in front of them in line. Announcements echoed overhead about gate changes and final boarding calls, the smell of overpriced coffee drifting from every kiosk, the low rumble of suitcase wheels rolling endlessly across tile. Diane checked in without incident, her ticket scanning clean on the first try, her boarding pass printing the way it always did, the agent behind the counter even commenting on how smooth her travel record looked across the years. There was no confusion, no flag, no hesitation, just the ordinary rhythm of a woman who had done this 1,000 times before and expected nothing different this time. She walked toward her gate, with her boarding pass tucked neatly into her coat pocket, her heels clicking steadily against the tile, completely unaware that the next half hour of her life was about to be filmed, judged, and ultimately remembered by strangers she would never personally meet. When she boarded the aircraft and made her way to her seat in the first-class cabin, she noticed it almost immediately. The way one of the flight attendants looked at her boarding pass and then looked at her, twice, as if the 2 pieces of information refused to connect in her mind. The attendant said nothing out loud, but she leaned toward her colleague and whispered something behind a polite smile, the kind of whisper that travels much further than anyone ever intends it to. A businessman, 2 rows back, murmured to the woman beside him that perhaps the lady had wandered into the wrong section, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by anyone curious enough to listen in. A second man across the aisle chuckled quietly, shaking his head as he returned to his newspaper, already certain of a story he had not bothered to ask a single question about. Diane settled into her seat anyway, opened her tablet, and began reviewing the documents for the meeting waiting for her on the other side of the flight. She had learned a long time ago that explaining herself to strangers, before they even asked a question, was a battle not worth fighting before the plane had even left the ground. Within minutes, 2 or 3 phones had quietly turned in her direction, recording nothing in particular yet, simply waiting, the way people do when they sense a story might be about to happen right in front of them. Diane had flown into that city the night before, from a different continent entirely, having spent 3 days walking the floors of a manufacturing plant her firm had been hired to evaluate, listening to line workers describe problems no executive had ever bothered to ask them about directly. She had slept only a few hours before her early flight, her mind still half occupied with notes she planned to finalize during the journey home, the kind of quiet mental clutter that comes from a career built on never fully switching off. She had chosen this particular airline for the final leg of her trip, specifically because its board had requested her presence in person, eager to demonstrate, in their words, that they took her recommendations seriously enough to fly her out themselves. None of that mattered to the people now watching her settle into her seat, because none of them had bothered to ask a single question before deciding who she must be and where she must belong on that aircraft. It was not a flight attendant who eventually approached her. It was the captain himself, a man named Gerald Whitmore, 55 years old, with 31 years of seniority and a reputation inside the company that bordered on legend among younger crew members. Pilots spoke of him with a kind of reverence, usually reserved for retired athletes, and passengers who recognized his voice over the intercom often relaxed simply because his name alone carried a certain old-fashioned authority. Younger flight attendants had been warned, almost as a rite of passage, never to question Gerald in front of passengers, regardless of what they personally believed was happening. Gerald walked the short distance from the cockpit with the confidence of a man who had never once been seriously challenged inside his own cabin. His uniform pressed, his posture exact, his expression already arranged into disapproval before a single word had even been exchanged. He did not ask Diane a single question. He did not glance at her ticket, did not check the manifest on the tablet clipped near the galley wall, did not pause for even a second to consider that perhaps there was an explanation other than the one already forming in his head. He simply looked her over, from the leather briefcase resting near her feet to the tailored coat draped over her shoulders, and decided, in less time than it takes to draw a breath, that she did not belong where she was sitting. His voice, when it finally came, was loud enough to fill the entire cabin, the kind of volume meant less for the person being addressed, and far more for the audience now watching them both. "Madam, economy is that way," Diane answered calmly, her voice even and unhurried, the same measured tone she might have used in a boardroom full of men twice as loud as he currently was. "I have a first-class ticket, Captain," she said, holding his gaze without flinching, without raising her voice to match his. Gerald let out a short, dismissive laugh, the kind that says far more about the person laughing than about the person being laughed at, and he shook his head as though she had told a joke in particularly poor taste. "You don't belong here," he repeated, louder this time, the words landing with the weight of an accusation rather than a simple correction. Diane reached into her bag without flinching and produced her boarding pass, holding it steady in front of him, the printed seat number clear and unmistakable in plain black ink against the white paper. Gerald did not bother to look down at it even once. He did not need to, in his own mind, because his decision had already been made the second he laid eyes on her standing in that aisle. What followed next happened close enough that several passengers later admitted, almost embarrassed, that they could feel his breath from where they sat. He leaned in, his face only inches from hers, and raised his voice again, sharper now, edged with something that sounded almost personal rather than professional. The entire cabin heard every word, the murmurs rippling outward like a stone dropped into still water, passengers turning in their seats, craning their necks toward the aisle, some recording quietly, some simply staring with open curiosity. A man near the front whispered to his seatmate that some people clearly never learn their place, and the woman beside him nodded, as if she had personally witnessed this exact scene play out in 100 different airports before. A teenager, traveling with her father, lowered her phone slightly, hesitating, as though some small part of her sensed something was deeply wrong with what she was filming. Nobody in that cabin considered, even for a second, that the calm woman standing in the aisle might actually be telling the truth. Gerald called for security before Diane had even finished lowering her boarding pass back to her side. The 2 flight attendants standing nearby exchanged a look of pure discomfort. neither one willing to be the person who questioned a captain with 31 years of seniority standing directly in front of them, arms crossed, jaw tight. Nobody dared interrupt him, not even when it was obvious to several onlookers that something about the situation did not quite add up, not even when one of the younger attendants opened her mouth as if to speak and then closed it again, deciding silence felt safer than honesty in that particular moment. A wealthy-looking man in seat 2 laughed under his breath and said something about people who never seemed to learn their lesson, and the woman across the aisle from him agreed instantly, adding that they always tried anyway, every single time, as if it were simply the way of the world. The cruelty in their voices was casual, almost bored. The kind of judgment people deliver when they have already decided the outcome of a story before it has even finished being told to them. Behind the curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin, a young attendant named Lisa Tran felt her stomach tighten with a sick, familiar dread, though she said nothing at all, staring instead at the floor near her shoes. A retired schoolteacher seated by the window, traveling to visit her grandchildren for the first time in over a year, watched the entire scene with growing discomfort she could not quite name out loud. She had spent 40 years in classrooms, teaching children to ask questions before forming opinions, and something about the certainty in the captain's voice reminded her uncomfortably of arguments she had broken up between students who had decided who was guilty before anyone had explained anything. She considered saying something, half rising from her seat before sitting back down again, telling herself it was not her place to intervene in a situation involving the crew. It was a decision she would think about for weeks afterward, long after the story had spread far beyond that single aircraft, wondering quietly what 40 years of teaching had actually taught her about the difference between believing in fairness and practicing it out loud when it actually cost something. Diane did not raise her voice. She did not argue, did not demand an apology, did not appeal to the dozens of strangers now openly watching the entire exchange unfold around her seat. She simply stood there, posture straight, expression unreadable, and asked one single question, in a voice so steady, it almost unsettled the people listening closest to her. "Is this your final decision, Captain?" she asked. Gerald answered without a flicker of doubt crossing his face. His chin lifted, his certainty entirely unwavering in front of his audience. "Absolutely," he said. And Diane, after a brief pause that felt far longer than the few seconds it actually lasted, replied with 2 words that nobody in that cabin would ever quite forget afterward. "Thank you." She gathered her briefcase, smoothed the front of her coat with one steady hand, and walked down the narrow aisle toward the exit, her steps unhurried, her dignity entirely intact, despite everything that had just been thrown carelessly at her in front of strangers. By the time she stepped off the aircraft, most of the passengers assumed the entire story was over, a minor inconvenience. An unpleasant scene quickly forgotten the moment the seatbelt sign finally came on overhead. The cabin doors closed. The safety briefing played overhead, mostly ignored by passengers still murmuring quietly about what they had just witnessed firsthand. The engines began their low hum, the familiar vibration that signals a flight is finally about to begin, and for a moment it seemed as though the entire incident would simply disappear into the ordinary noise of departure, like so many small dramas before it. Then, just as the aircraft began its slow roll away from the gate, the radio crackled, with a voice from air traffic control, instructing them to hold position immediately. 5 minutes passed without explanation. Then 10, the cabin growing restless, several passengers glancing at watches and exchanging irritated looks with one another. Passengers began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, checking phones for service, certain this was nothing more than a routine delay, the kind every frequent flyer has come to expect and quietly resent in equal measure on long travel days. Gerald requested clearance again, his tone clipped with the impatience of a man unaccustomed to waiting on anyone for anything. The response from the tower was brief and entirely unhelpful, offering no explanation beyond instructions to remain at the gate until further notice was given. 15 minutes became 20, and the murmurs throughout the cabin shifted from simple annoyance to something closer to genuine unease, the kind of quiet tension that spreads through a confined space when nobody fully understands what is happening, but everybody can sense that it matters. Outside the window, passengers seated near the wing began to notice unfamiliar vehicles approaching the aircraft from across the tarmac. flashing lights cutting sharply through the gray morning haze, moving with a purpose that clearly had nothing to do with refueling or routine maintenance checks. A police vehicle from the airport authority pulled up first, followed closely by an unmarked federal car, and then, trailing slightly behind both, a sleek black sedan bearing the unmistakable insignia of the airline's own corporate headquarters. Nobody on board fully understood what any of it meant, only that whatever was unfolding outside on the tarmac had very little to do with weather, mechanical failure, or any of the ordinary excuses airlines usually offered. A small group climbed the boarding stairs without ceremony, their expressions unreadable, their pace deliberate rather than rushed in any visible way. They said very little as they moved through the cabin toward the front, ignoring the curious stares of passengers who had spent the last 20 minutes quietly speculating about everything from security threats to engine trouble. One of them, a woman in a dark blazer holding a tablet against her chest, walked directly toward the cockpit and addressed the captain in a tone that allowed absolutely no room for negotiation or delay. "Captain Whitmore, please step out of the cockpit," she said, her voice calm but absolute, the kind of calm that comes only from someone who already knows precisely how a conversation is going to end before it even begins. Gerald's composure, so unshakable only minutes earlier in the aisle, cracked almost instantly under the weight of her tone. "Why?" he demanded, his voice rising in a way it had not risen since his confrontation with Diane. Nobody bothered to answer him. The rest of the flight crew were asked to remain seated quietly, their expressions shifting rapidly from confusion to something resembling genuine fear, as they slowly realized this was not a routine inspection of any kind. The aircraft powered down completely, the cabin lights dimming slightly, as the engines fell silent for the second time that morning. And passengers who had been merely irritated only minutes earlier now sat in a tense, watchful quiet that filled the entire space. Whispers spread quickly from row to row, theories multiplying faster than anyone could possibly confirm them, until finally one of the executives who had boarded asked the single question that silenced the entire cabin, instantly and completely. "Where is Miss Prescott?" "Diane Coleman," he asked, his eyes scanning the rows methodically, as though searching for someone he fully expected to recognize the moment he saw her face. The cabin, which only half an hour earlier had laughed quietly at her expense, without a second thought, fell into a stillness so complete that the hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed almost deafening by comparison. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly have known from where they sat, was that the woman they had watched be humiliated in the narrow aisle was not simply a passenger who had wandered into the wrong section of an airplane by mistake. Diane Coleman's firm had spent the better part of 8 months carefully negotiating a consulting contract worth several $100 million with this exact airline. A deal designed to overhaul everything from operational efficiency to customer service culture across their entire fleet network. The board had personally arranged for her to fly that specific morning so she could finalize the last stage of the agreement in person, a detail kept deliberately quiet at her own explicit request, since she had never once wanted her presence to alter how she was treated by the very people she had been hired to evaluate honestly. The entire trip had been coordinated through official channels weeks in advance, every detail confirmed, every signature pending, except for the final one waiting in a folder inside her briefcase. Nobody on that aircraft, least of all the captain standing rigid near the cockpit, had any idea who she truly was, because Diane had built her entire professional reputation on a simple but unforgiving guiding principle that few outside her firm ever fully understood. She believed that the truest measure of any company was not how it treated its most important clients or its wealthiest customers, but how it treated the people it quietly assumed did not matter at all. For years, she had conducted what colleagues privately called her invisible audits, traveling without title, without announcement, without anything that might tip the scales of how she was personally received by strangers. She had done it inside hotels, inside restaurants, inside retail chains. Her firm had been hired to evaluate from the ground up, always blending into the crowd of ordinary customers until the precise moment the truth needed to surface on its own. It was a method that had exposed more genuine corporate dysfunction than any spreadsheet or quarterly report ever could, because people reveal exactly who they truly are only when they believe no one important is watching them closely. Gerald Whitmore, in his 31 years of seniority and his unshaken certainty, had simply never once imagined that the calm woman he screamed at in the aisle might be the very person his entire company depended on to survive its next difficult fiscal year. The investigators did not rely on guesswork or speculation of any kind once they boarded. Within minutes of arriving, they had already requested footage from every camera that had captured the morning's events, beginning at the gate and ending inside the cabin itself, leaving no gap unexamined. The footage from the boarding area showed Diane checking in without any incident whatsoever, her documents scanning cleanly, her brief interaction with the gate agent entirely unremarkable from start to finish. The cabin cameras, installed quietly years earlier for routine safety compliance, and rarely reviewed unless something went seriously and visibly wrong, told an even clearer story, frame by frame, second by second, with no room left anywhere for interpretation or excuse. They showed a woman who never once raised her voice, never once gestured aggressively toward anyone, never once did anything beyond calmly presenting a valid ticket for a seat that legally and rightfully belonged to her. What the footage also showed, in painful and entirely undeniable detail, was a captain who never once checked her boarding pass, never once consulted the manifest readily available on his own tablet, and never paused, even for a single moment, to consider that his immediate assumption might simply be wrong. It showed him leaning into her personal space without invitation, his voice raised loud enough to humiliate her in front of dozens of strangers, his words carrying the unmistakable weight of prejudice, dressed up carelessly as routine protocol. It showed flight attendants standing frozen nearby, complicit not through any direct action, but through their own silence, too afraid of a man with 31 years of seniority to speak the one sentence that might have stopped everything before it ever started. Two of those attendants, when finally interviewed separately later, that same day by investigators, broke down in tears before they had even finished their first full sentence, admitting that they had known something was deeply wrong and had chosen to say absolutely nothing anyway. They confessed, voices shaking, that questioning Gerald Whitmore had never once felt like a realistic option available to people in their junior position, regardless of what their training manuals had explicitly instructed them to do in exactly this kind of difficult moment. The lead investigator, a quiet man named Robert Casey, who had spent nearly 2 decades reviewing aviation incidents of every kind, later described this particular case as one of the clearest examples of unchecked authority he had encountered in his entire career. He noted, in his official report, that the most troubling detail was not the captain's outburst itself, but the sheer number of people who had the opportunity to stop it and chose instead to watch. He interviewed 11 passengers individually that same afternoon, and nearly every one of them admitted, when pressed directly, that some quiet part of them had sensed the situation was unfair, even as it unfolded in front of their own eyes. Only one passenger, the retired schoolteacher by the window, openly admitted to investigators that she regretted not speaking up sooner, her voice catching slightly, as she explained that she had spent her entire career teaching children to do exactly what she herself had failed to do that morning. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, Gerald finally understood the full weight of what he had done that morning, and the realization seemed to physically alter him in front of everyone watching, his shoulders dropping, his certainty visibly draining from his face like color, slowly leaving an old photograph. He asked, quietly this time, to speak with Diane privately, and to the surprise of nearly everyone still watching from their seats, she agreed, walking with him to a quiet corner near the galley, where the cameras could still observe them, but the rest of the cabin could no longer hear their exact words. He apologized, the words clumsy and rushed, the kind of apology that comes far more from panic than from any genuine moment of reflection, the kind shaped more by sudden consequence than by honest conscience. Diane listened to all of it without once interrupting him, her expression patient but entirely unmoved by the performance unfolding in front of her. And when he finally finished speaking, she asked him a single question that seemed to hang suspended in the air far longer than the few seconds it actually took to say out loud. "If I weren't a CEO," she asked quietly, "would you still be standing here apologizing to me right now?" Gerald opened his mouth to answer her, and found, for what may have been the very first time in his entire career, that he genuinely had nothing at all to say in response. The silence that followed that question traveled through the cabin in a way the earlier confrontation never quite had. Passengers who had laughed openly at her expense less than an hour earlier now sat completely motionless, several of them lowering their phones for the first time since the entire ordeal had begun, suddenly aware that whatever footage they had personally recorded told a story very different from the one they had originally assumed they were witnessing. The handful of live streams still running among passengers shifted almost instantly in tone, comment sections quickly filling with outrage, directed not at the woman who had been removed from her seat, but squarely at the man who had removed her without cause. Strangers, who would never meet either of them, began debating the moment publicly, before the aircraft had even reopened its doors to the airport staff waiting outside, the footage spreading faster than anyone on board could have reasonably anticipated that morning. By the time the federal investigators finished their initial review of every available recording, public opinion outside that aircraft had already quietly rendered its own verdict, long before any official statement had ever been issued by the airline itself. The airline's board did not wait long to act once the full picture became clear, though their urgency had less to do with simple fairness and far more to do with the company's own survival in the days ahead. Within hours, executives realized this was not an isolated incident at all, but instead, the latest entry in a troubling pattern, several prior complaints involving the very same captain having been quietly filed away and conveniently forgotten by middle managers eager to avoid any conflict with a senior pilot of his standing. Internal records, once finally pulled from storage and reviewed line by line, revealed at least 4 other similar incidents over the past several years, each one dismissed, minimized, or simply buried beneath paperwork that nobody had ever bothered to revisit afterward. Gerald Whitmore was suspended that very same afternoon, his decades of seniority offering absolutely no protection against footage that left no room whatsoever for ambiguity or excuse of any kind. An internal investigation was opened immediately, not only into his individual conduct that morning, but into the broader culture across the airline that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked for so many years without any real consequence. The board meeting that evening ran far longer than scheduled, executives arguing over how much of the footage should ever be made public and how much should remain confined to legal files and human resources archives. One senior vice president argued that the company should quietly settle and move on as quickly as possible, hoping the story would fade from public attention within a week or two at most. Another, younger and newer to the board, pushed back forcefully, insisting that quiet settlements were exactly the reason a captain with 4 prior complaints had still been allowed to command an aircraft that morning. The conversation grew tense, voices rising over a long mahogany table, until the chief executive finally silenced the room by sliding a printed transcript of Diane's single question across the table for everyone to read for themselves. "If I weren't a CEO, would you still be apologizing right now?" Nobody at that table had an answer either, and the silence that followed told them everything they needed to know about which direction the company had to choose. Diane, despite everything that had happened to her that particular morning, did not walk away from the partnership the airline so desperately needed in order to recover. She agreed to continue the consulting relationship, the deal far too important, and the potential for genuine cultural change far too significant to abandon entirely over the actions of one man, however inexcusable his actions had truly been. She set only one condition before finally signing the last page of the agreement, a condition the board accepted without a moment of hesitation, given everything that had just happened in front of so many witnesses. Every manager across the entire airline, from gate agents to senior pilots with decades of experience, would be required to complete a comprehensive new training program covering respectful leadership, genuine customer treatment, the recognition of unconscious bias, and proper conflict resolution under pressure. It was not punishment dressed up cleverly as policy. It was, in her own words, to the board that very afternoon, the only realistic way to ensure that what had happened to her that morning never happened again to someone, without her particular resources or her particular platform to be heard and believed. In the weeks that followed, the story quietly moved beyond the original aircraft entirely, reshaping conversations inside boardrooms that had nothing directly to do with the airline at all. Other companies, watching from a cautious distance, began quietly reviewing their own complaint records, wondering uncomfortably how many similar incidents had been buried in their own files, without anyone ever noticing the pattern forming underneath. Diane herself received calls from executives she had never personally met, asking for guidance on how to identify the same kind of quiet, institutional blindness that had nearly cost the airline everything in a single morning. She answered most of them patiently, repeating the same simple truth in slightly different words each time, that bias rarely announces itself loudly, and that the most dangerous kind almost always wears the comfortable disguise of confidence and seniority. Diane also insisted, against the initial objections of several board members, that Gerald Whitmore himself be required to sit through the very first session of the new training program, rather than simply disappearing quietly from the company altogether. She believed, perhaps stubbornly, that punishment without any attempt at genuine understanding rarely changed anything beyond the surface, and that a man who had spent 31 years assuming his judgment was beyond question needed to sit in a room and actually listen for once in his life. Gerald attended that first session in near total silence, watching footage of himself that he had somehow never fully processed, despite living through it personally, his face unreadable to the colleagues seated around him. He did not speak during the session, and nobody expected him to, but several attendees later noted that he stayed afterward, alone, watching the recording loop a second time on the screen at the front of the empty room. A month later, the airline rolled out its new training program across every single hub in its network, the footage from that original morning quietly repurposed as an internal teaching tool, rather than buried as a public scandal, to be forgotten over time. New employees watched the recording carefully during onboarding, not to shame any one individual involved, but to understand exactly how quickly assumption can curdle into outright cruelty when nobody standing in the room is willing to stop it from happening. Gerald Whitmore's name, once spoken with genuine reverence inside the company hallways, no longer appeared anywhere near the airline's promotional materials or official training videos, his decades of seniority quietly erased from the legacy he had spent an entire career carefully building for himself. The board invited Diane to speak personally at the official launch of the new program, an invitation she accepted not out of pride in what had happened to her, but out of a genuine belief that the story deserved to mean something lasting beyond a single viral moment captured on a stranger's phone. She stood at the front of a crowded conference room filled with employees from every level of the company, gate agents seated beside vice presidents, flight attendants seated beside members of the board, who had personally walked onto that aircraft weeks earlier. Respect should never depend on a title, a seat, or the color of someone's skin, she told them, her voice steady, carrying none of the anger anyone in that room might have reasonably expected from her, and none of it actually required to make her point land. The true test of character, she continued, is how we treat people before we know who they are, not after we discover what they can do for us or take away from us in return. The room rose to its feet in applause that lasted far longer than any ceremony strictly required. The kind of applause that comes only when people recognize they have just heard something they will quietly carry with them long after they leave that particular building. Cameras set up in the back of the room slowly panned toward a small group of young flight attendants standing near the exit, their expressions a mixture of quiet recognition and something closer to resolve, the full weight of that morning's lesson finally settling somewhere inside them. It would not easily leave again. Lisa Tran, the young attendant who had felt that sick, familiar dread weeks earlier and said nothing, stood near the back of that same room with her arms folded loosely across her chest, listening to every single word Diane spoke, without once looking away. She thought about the exact moment she had wanted to say something on that aircraft and had stayed quiet instead, and she promised herself, quietly, standing in that crowded room, that she would never again let fear of a senior title silence her judgment in front of a passenger who deserved better treatment. She was not alone in that promise. Several other attendants scattered throughout the room later admitted in private conversations that they had replayed that same morning in their heads more times than they could count, wondering what might have happened differently if even one of them had simply spoken up at the right moment instead of looking away toward the floor. After the applause finally settled and the room began to empty, a younger executive named Marcus Holloway approached Diane near the exit, introducing himself as the man who had boarded the aircraft that morning, and asked, in front of everyone, where she was. He admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he had spent weeks afterward replaying his own role in the story, wondering whether the company would have acted half as quickly had the woman in that aisle been anyone other than the executive his company depended on for a multi-million-dollar contract. Diane considered the question carefully before answering, choosing her words the way she always did, with the patience of someone who had spent a career turning uncomfortable truths into useful lessons rather than simply walking away from them. Probably not, she admitted honestly. And that is precisely the problem your company now has to solve. Not because of what happened to me, but because of what happens every single day to people without my particular leverage. Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of her honesty settling over him in a way that no internal memo or quarterly report ever could have managed on its own. In the months that fussed, the airline's customer complaint numbers shifted in ways the board had not entirely anticipated when they first approved the new training program. Complaints involving discrimination or dismissive treatment dropped sharply across every hub, while complaints about genuinely difficult passengers, the kind every airline inevitably deals with regardless of policy, remained roughly the same as before. Employee surveys, conducted quietly 6 months after the incident, showed a measurable shift in how junior staff described their willingness to question senior colleagues when something felt wrong during a flight. It was not a perfect transformation, and Diane herself was the first to caution the board against believing one training program could permanently fix a problem that had taken decades to take root inside their culture. But it was, by every measure, the board could reasonably track, a genuine beginning, the kind of slow institutional change that rarely makes headlines, but quietly reshapes an organization from the inside out over time. What happened on that aircraft was never really about a single seat, or a single boarding pass, or even about Gerald Whitmore himself, though all three played their part in a story that would be retold for years afterward inside that company's training rooms across the country. It was about the remarkable speed with which people decide who belongs and who does not, often before a single fact has even been checked, often before a single honest question has been asked in good faith. It was about the silence of bystanders, the flight attendants who knew something was deeply wrong and said absolutely nothing, the passengers who laughed, instead of pausing to question what they were actually witnessing unfold right in front of them that morning. It was about the quiet, unglamorous courage of a woman who chose dignity over confrontation, who answered cruelty with calm rather than rage, and who ultimately turned her own public humiliation into a lesson that would outlast the headline it briefly generated online. A single careless word, spoken without thought in a crowded cabin, has the power to wound deeply and permanently in ways the speaker may never fully understand. A single deliberate action, taken at exactly the right moment, by exactly the right person, has the power to reshape an entire company's culture for everyone who comes after them. Years later, long after the headlines had faded and the footage had stopped circulating among strangers online, employees at that airline still spoke of the morning. A captain screamed at a woman in first class, though most of them no longer remembered his name at all. What they remembered instead was the calm in her voice, the steadiness in her posture, and the simple, devastating question she had asked him in that quiet corner near the galley. They remembered that respect given freely, without waiting to learn someone's title or their net worth or the size of their company, was the only kind of respect that ever truly meant anything at all. And somewhere in that lesson, repeated in training rooms across an entire industry, a small but meaningful shift had taken root. One boarding pass, one bystander, one moment of courage at a time.